Hey guys, tonight we begin with something slightly less philosophical, though arguably just as complex. Vikings X. It was politics, power, and occasionally very public. So, before used, comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's get this out of the way. The Vikings were cleaner than you've been told. No, not spa day clean, but by medieval standards, they were practically soap-scented angels. While much of Europe was busy pretending bathing was a sin or just inconvenient, the Norse were over there scrubbing themselves. Weekly using actual soap, made from animal fat and ash. It smelled earthy probably, but compared to their unwashed neighbors, they were a walking cloud of lavender and smugness. They combed their hair, trimmed their beards, filed their nails, and even carried grooming kits made from bone and iron. Imagine pulling up to a longhouse date with a carved comb, neat braids, and fresh breath, in an era where most people still had hay in their armpits. English monks noticed this disturbing hygiene trend and recorded it bitterly. There's one infamous complaint from an Anglo-Saxon chronicler who basically whined that Viking men were too clean and thus unfairly attractive to local women. That's right. Their official explanation for Viking success with the ladies was soap-based cheating. The monks weren't wrong. In a world that smelled like a compost bin, the guy who bathed once a week and knew how to braid his share was basically a sex god. But this wasn't just vanity. In Viking society, personal hygiene had status. If you were a free man, you were expected to look like one, and that meant grooming. If you were unkempt, people assumed you were poor, enslaved, or worse. A lazayabout who couldn't even comb out a single lice egg for his woman. Cleanliness also had ritual significance. Before feasts, before battles, before bedroom adventures. Washed. It wasn't just about removing dirt. It was about preparing yourself to be presentable to God's ancestors, or your extremely discerning longhouse crush. If you think Viking romance was just grunting and dragging someone into a longhouse by their braid, think again. These were not just bloodthirsty raiders. They were also deeply sensitive, metaphor-loving weirdos, hoax-pressed love through poetry, and sometimes mild threats. Vikings had an entire tradition of skaldic poetry, a type of verse so dense with metaphor, it makes Shakespeare look like a And yes, they used it to flirt. A Viking man might compare a woman's hair to sunlit flax, her walk to a swan on the sea, or if things were real lighting up, her body to a well-tempered sword. That's not a pickup line. That's cultural seduction. If your poem didn't come with at least 3 obscure nature references, you were doing it wrong. Beauty wasn't all flowers and fjords. These poems could get graphic. And if a man composed poetry about a woman without her consent, that was considered dangerous. In some cases, illegal. There's an actual law in the medieval Icelandic Grágás Code that banned men from writing any defamatory or obscene poetry. If a man implied a woman had been sexually available when she hadn't, that could result in exile or even death. So yes, in Viking society, writing a dirty limerick about someone's daughter could lead to legal consequences and a duel. Women, by the way, didn't just stand there blushing. They were fully capable of composing biting verse in return. If a man's poem was lame, crude, or lazy, she might humiliate him publicly with a retort so scathing that entire families would avoid eye contact at feasts for generations. In one saga, a woman rebukes a man's advance with such poetic finesse that Helle's humiliated and joins a monastery. That's right. She flirted so hard in reverse, he found God. So while Vikings carried swords and axes, the real weapon in matters of the heart, poetry, loaded with metaphors, laced with bragging, and legally actionable if you got too confident. Let's not kid ourselves. Viking romance wasn't exactly built on rose petals and candlelight. It was more like, your father has 3 goats. I have a strong back. Let's make a legally binding agreement. Consent existed, yes, but it had to elbow its way through a crowd of Dowries, alliances, and extended family members who all had opinions. Here's how it usually worked. A man decided he wanted to marry. He didn't go serenading his beloved under the stars. He sent his dad, or his uncle, or his most diplomatic friend to the girl's father to negotiate a deal, because nothing screams passion like your potential future being discussed over me in sheep valuation. And the woman should technically had a say. Technically, a freeborn woman could refuse a match, but whether that was honored depended entirely on how much her family needed land, allies, or to offload an opinionated daughter. Some sagas suggest that a strong-willed woman could turn down a suitor. Others suggest she'd better run fast if she tried. Still, the Vikings weren't entirely barbaric about it. A woman who was forcibly married had legal recourse. She could stand before witnesses and declare herself divorced. No paperwork, no court, just 3 public announcements. Basically, the medieval Norse version of "It's not me, it's you," shouted at a dinner party. And while abducting a bride might sound romantic in some badly translated sagas, Viking law did frown upon. It frown, not necessarily stop. Kidnapping a woman for marriage was illegal, but also occasionally celebrated in poetry. Nothing says mixed messaging like a legal code and a love ballad giving you opposite advice. Then there were concubines, or as Viking law charmingly called them, bedthers. These were women, often enslaved, while were expected to provide companionship, cooking, and of course, sex. Consent in this case, mostly decorative. On the bright side, if a husband wasn't up to the job, emotionally or physically, the wife could leave. Viking women didn't have to suffer in silence. They could suffer loudly in public, and with legal backup. When it came to premarital relationships, the Vikings were, let's just say, flexible, unlike their medieval neighbors, who were busy obsessing over chastity belts and writing purity odds. The Norse took a more relaxed view. In fact, a woman's past experience wasn't necessarily a deal-breaker, unless it involved, say, someone else's husband, or a very public scandal involving the neighbor's hoft. Being romantically involved before marriage wasn't taboo, it was life. Vikings were practical people. If 2 consenting adults had a relationship, the world didn't collapse. Families might raise an eyebrow, or both, if the timing was suspicious, but they wouldn't lock their daughters in towers or start inventing chastity gadgets. Virginity was never treated as a woman's value. Women were respected for their skills, their family standing, and yes, their reputation. But that reputation didn't hinge entirely on what they had or hadn't done in the bedroom. In fact, some sagas even praise bold women who went after what or who they wanted, especially if they did it with confidence and a strong sword arm. This wasn't just cultural flexibility, it was survival logic. Viking society needed strong partnerships. A woman who could manage a farm, handle trade, and hold her own in a legal dispute was far more valuable than one with a perfectly untouched romantic history. Life was hard. Winter was longer. Practicality usually won. That said, discretion was still encouraged. While premarital relationships weren't punished, boasting about them could get you into trouble. If a man bragged publicly about a past partner and she hadn't consented to the story being told, he could face legal consequences. Essentially, kiss and tell was considered both rude and in some cases illegal. In short, the Vikings respected agency as long as it didn't cause unnecessary drama at the feast. If you thought modern mythology gets weird, just wait until you meet the Norse pantheon, a divine soap opera where shape-shifting, cross-dressing, and dramatic romantic entanglements were just Tuesday. Let's start with Frey, the god offered to. Frey wasn't subtle. He was frequently depicted with, let's say, overwhelming gentism for his role. His sacred statue reportedly came with anatomically confident features, and his worship involved rituals that celebrated life, love, and very suggestive crops. If you were hoping for a god of modesty, Frey was not your man. Then there's Loki, everyone's favorite chaos agent. In one story, Loki transforms into a mare. Yes, a female horse to distract a magical stallion, and it works so well, in fact, that Loki becomes pregnant, and Loki gives birth to an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir. Somehow, this is treated as a quirky anecdote, rather than a cosmic HR incident. In another tale, Thor cross-dresses to infiltrate a wedding feast, and recover his stolen hammer. His disguise, a bridal gown, and a veil. His plan, grunt a lot, and hope no one notices the bride's beard. Spoiler, they notice, but hammer is recovered, and everyone goes home slightly confused. Why does any of this matter? Because the Vikings didn't view romance, gender, or intimacy as neat little categories. Their myths were messy, fluid, and gloriously inappropriate by modern Sunday school standards. In fact, many Norse descent heroes engaged in relationships that modern cultures would spend entire legal seminars trying to explain. The line between affection and absurdity was thin, and the gods crossed it regularly, usually on horseback. But here's the twist. These myths weren't seen as shocking. They were normal. Fertility, love, trickery, these were all divine forces. The gods behaved badly, not because they were evil, but because life is complicated. And sometimes your greatest lesson comes from a shape-shifting horseman. Viking society had rules, lots of them. But when it came to gender and relationships, those rules were negotiable, flexible, or to put it bluntly, do what you want. Just don't get caught looking unmanly while doing it. Let's explain. For Viking men, the worst thing you could be called wasn't a thief, a liar, or even a coward. It was urgy, a word so loaded it made people duel over it. Being called urgy meant you were passive, submissive, or somehow falletto, uphold your manly duties, especially in, let's say, the romantic department. It wasn't about orientation. It was about dominance. Viking masculinity was defined by who you were with, but by how you behaved. If you were seen as shielding, you weren't just mocked. Your entire reputation could crumble faster than a poorly built long ship. Women, on the other hand, had a little more wiggle room, while the society was male-dominated, and don't worry, it absolutely was. Women had social and legal rights that would make many medieval European ladies green with envy. They could own land, request divorces, and yes, make their preferences known. Still, expectations were very real. A woman who was too-spoken or assertive might be labeled masculine, which in a weird Viking twist wasn't always an insult. Some saga heroines are praised for their sharp tongues and sword skills, but the same traits in a man, if aimed the wrong way, could get him publicly ridiculed or accused of sorcery. That's right, practicing magic, particularly sitter, a kind of Norse ritual often linked with emotion and foresight, was considered retinally. It was women's work. If a man did it, people assumed he was probably weaving something, crying, and being suspiciously poetic. The irony. Odin, the all-father of Norse gods, was a master of cedar. But apparently when he did it, it was strategic. When you did it, it was shameful. Classic management, double standard. In Viking society, sticks and stones could break your bones, but words could legally get you stabbed. Insults weren't just playground drama. If someone questioned your honor, your masculinity, or your performance in the bedroom, you could literally challenge them to a duel. That's right. Say the wrong thing and you might find yourself standing shirtless in the woods at dawn, sword in hand, all because you implied your neighbor Olaf was less than enthusiastic under the firs. At the heart of this was something called Enid, a special category of public insult. If you called Sumia Nargri or Rager, both of which roughly translate to unmanly in a way no one wanted to hear, that was grounds for a fight and not a verbal one. We're talking legally sanctioned combat, sometimes to the death. Now, before you assume Vikings were just wildly insecure, remember that reputation weighs everything. These were small, tight-knit communities. If someone accused you of being weak, cowardly, or ultimate insult, romantically passive, it wasn't just personal. It was social career ending. And it worked both ways. If you hurled an accusation and couldn't back it up in a duel or court, you could be the one exiled. So, people chose their insults carefully, and when they didn't, well, someone ended up bleeding next to a fjord. Interestingly, these disputes weren't always about what actually happened in someone's private life. Often, they were about perception. Rumors, offhand remarks, a badly timed joke, all could trigger chaos if they cast doubt on someone's identity or status. In short, Viking society had zero chill when it came to trash talk, but all of this reveals something deeper. Intimacy and public image were linked. A man's romantic reputation was his strength. If you were mocked for being passive, delicate, or losing control, you did not just lose face. You lost credibility, and once that was gone, good luck keeping your seat at the feast. In Viking society, love and marriage were all well and good until someone got caught with the neighbor's spouse. Then things got loud, legal, and occasionally bloody. Let's start with the basics. Adultery was frowned upon, but not equally for everyone. If a married woman was caught being unfaithful, that was serious business. Her husband could have divorced her, shame her publicly, or depending on the insult to his honor, take up his sword and negotiate with the other man directly. In extreme cases, the lover might end up significantly less alive than when he arrived. Now, if a man was unfaithful to his wife, well, it depended. Sleeping with an unmarried woman wasn't usually a huge scandal, but if the woman was married to someone else, that crossed a line. Especially if her husband had a temper, or a lot of brothers. And hairswear, it gets spicy. If a wife found out her husband was cheating, she could take illegal action and divorce him. Viking women had real options. In fact, Sagas tell of wives who calmly packed up their belongings, declared the marriage over, in front of witnesses, and walked off, sometimes taking the farm, the kids, and the goats. Now, the Norse legal system didn't just rely on whispered accusations. If you claimed someone committed adultery, you had to prove it. This usually involved catching them in the act, or gathering witnesses, which, as you can imagine, made for some very awkward family dinners. And while physical consequences weren't always legally sanctioned, let's just say that Viking vengeance culture didn't require a permission slip. If someone dishonored your household, it wasn't shocking to respond with a broken door, a burned barn, or a suspiciously timed hunt in Gastiden. But despite the risk, people still cheated. Humans are consistent like that. Ultimately, Viking adultery laws were less about morality and more about honor and property. Who got chimney, who got stabbed, and who got the livestock afterward. That's what really mattered. So, no. Adultery didn't come with scarlet letters. It came with lawsuits, jewels, and the occasional goat-related custody battle. Viking romance didn't always rely on charm, poetry, or a strong jawline. Sometimes it relied on magic, specifically a mysterious practice called cider, pronounced sour, which was part sorcery, part spiritual therapy, and part my ex want return my runes. Cider was used for many things, predicting the future, cursing enemies, influencing the weather, and occasionally manipulating glove and desire. If your affections weren't being returned, a well-placed spell might just make someone suddenly think, you were the most desirable human this side of Valhalla. Coincidence? Never. But here's the twist. Sidra was considered a Freyja. Women practiced it openly, often as respected cheers or shamans. Men, not so much. A man dabbling in Saga risked being labeled unmanly, not because oft magic itself, but because he was seen as performing female work, which Viking masculinity didn't handle well. There's even a saga where Odin, the literal king of the gods, is called out for using Satyr. His enemy's basicalizzi. Wow, great spell. Very mystical. Also, you're kind of embarrassing us. Odin, to his credit, doesn't care. When you've got one eye and a pet raven, public opinion just doesn't sting theism. As for the love magic itself, it ranged from harmless charms to full-blown enchantments. Think, drink this herbal tea and fall madly in love, mixed with, if you don't, something unfortunate might happen to your cows. The Vikings never did anything halfway. Of course, there were risks. If you were caught using magic to win someone's affection, especially without consent, it could backfire, both legally and supernaturally. People believed that misused magic could rebound like a badly carved boomerang, and you really didn't want your love spell turning into a village-wide outbreak of emotional confusion. Still, for those with a little courage and a bag of herbs, cedar offered options. No Dowrian could write love poetry, but anyone could try a charm and hope it worked. Modern romance thrives on ambience, dim lighting, candles, Spotify playlists. Vikings, on the other hand, had firelight, the sound of livestock snoring, and 6 relatives pretending not to notice anything. Let's talk about privacy, or more specifically, the complete lack of it. Viking homes were longhouses, big open buildings, where entire families lived, worked, ate, and yes, slept together. Not in a weird way, but in a weird-treeing not to freeze to death kind of way. The whole clan, parents, grandparents, children, workers, and sometimes a goat or two, shared the same space, walls, optional, curtains, luxuries, personal space. The concept had not yet arrived in Scandinavia, so, when it came to intimacy, you didn't exactly sneak off to a cozy private suite. You may burrowed over toward the fire, pulled a fur blanket up, and tried to ignore the sound of Uncle Bedjern loudly snoring 2 feet away. Romantic. Not really. Efficient. Absolutely. This lack of privacy didn't stop anyone. Viking culture was remarkably unbothered by the realities of communal living. People just accepted that intimacy happened, occasionally within earshot, occasionally while someone was stirring stew. Children were often conceived in crowded long houses, and everyone sort of developed a collective skill called strategic pretending. You didn't acknowledge what was going on. You didn't comment. You definitely didn't make eye contact. You simply stared into the fire and thought about fish. Now, if you really wanted privacy, Yahoo had options. Kind of wealthier families might hang tapestries or set up dividers, the Viking equivalent of a do not disturb sign. But for the average Norse couple, a little discretion and good timing were the best you could hope for. Still, despite the lack of privacy, there was no real shame. Viking society didn't obsess over modesty the way later Christian Europe did. Physical intimacy was natural, necessary, and they just didn't want to talk about it while grandma was within earshot. Let's talk about contraception, or as the Vikings knew it, hope, herbs, and possibly magic. Now, there's no detailed medical manual from the Viking Age titled How to Not Have Kids When You're Busy Pillaging, but there are clues, and based on those, it's safe to say they had some idea, to manage reproduction, or at least slow it down when necessary. First off, Viking women were extremely knowledgeable about herbs, not just for healing wounds or curing fevers, but for lessening the chance of sudden family expansion. Plants like juniper, mugwort, and wild carrot were known throughout Europe for their possible contraceptive properties. Did they work? Possibly. Did they taste like sadness and regret? Probably. There's also evidence that certain practices like Extended breastfeeding were used strategically to delay the next pregnancy. Not exactly romantic, but effective. Think of it as the Viking version of family spacing, minus the spreadsheets. But here's the twist. Viking culture didn't obsess over reproduction the way later religious societies did. Children were valued, yes, especially sons who could fight, and daughters who could marry well. But sex wasn't only about making heirs. Pleasure was very much part of the equation. Even in the sagas, romantic encounters are described with a surprising amount of realism. Couples fall in love, grow apart, or get bored and divorce each other. That kind of casual acknowledgement of human nature suggests a culture that wasn't fixated in purity or guilt, just practicality. Of course, if contraception failed, their responsibility almost always fell on the woman. Men weren't expected to know much about those things. A man might be able to sail across a stormy sea using just the stars and a raven. But ask him how mugwort works, and he'd stare at you like you'd grown a second axe. If you've ever wondered whether same-sex relationships exist in Viking society, the short answer is yes. The long answer is yes, but only if you really managed the optics. The Vikings didn't use our modern terms for sexuality, but they certainly understood that people sometimes formed close, even romantic bonds with others of the same gender. And while that might seem surprisingly open-minded for an axe-swinging culture, it came with one massive catch: honor.uc. Viking masculinity was built on dominance, not just in battle, but in every area of life. If two men were involved, the social fallout didn't revolve around who they loved, but who did what, specifically. The man seen as taking the passive role could be mocked, shamed, or worse, challenged for his manhood. This wasn't about morality, it was about status. A man could wear furs, braid his beard, and serenade his best friend with emotional poetry, and still be admired. But if someone implied he wasn't the dominant force in his private life, that could destroy his reputation, faster than a leaky long ship. There are even saga accounts of men being accused of such things, and then demanding duels to defend their honor. Because clearly nothing says I'm definitely the alpha like fighting Sumi at dawn because of a rumor about cuddling. And what about women? Honestly, they got far less attention in the legal texts, likely because their relationships weren't seen as threatening to the social order. Two women together didn't produce heirs, didn't mess with property rights, and didn't challenge the male ego. So, while we don't have much direct evidence, it's entirely possible that such relationships existed and were quietly accepted, or at least politically. Interestingly, the Norse gods didn't care much about gender at all. Loki, as we've mentioned, had children in both male and female forms, and no one batted an eye. The divine realm was fluid. It was just the humans who needed everything to fit neatly into a saga-friendly narrative. If you thought Viking marriage was all about long feasts, exchanged swords and blood oaths, you might be surprised to learn casually it could end. Because, in Viking society, divorce wasn't some drawn-out legal drama. It was more like, I'm done. I'm taking the ox. Good luck. Seriously, Viking women could divorce their husbands, and they didn't need a lawyer, a judge, or a ceremonial raven. All they needed was a clear voice and a couple of witnesses. Here's how it worked. A woman could end the marriage of B standing in front of a group of people, preferably at the front door or the couple's bed. Yes, really, and declaring that she was leaving. Bonus points if she could name why she was leaving, like abandonment, violence, Orth, classic. He won't stop reciting bad poetry in bed. And that was it. Once the declaration was made, the marriage was considered dissolved. Property and children would then be divided, usually according to social custom or pre-existing agreements. It wasn't always clean, but it was shockingly assigned. No waiting 6 months. No custody battles dragged through 3 winters. What's more, Viking women often walked away with their dowries intact, and in some cases kept control of land or valuables. they brought into the marriage. Divorce didn't make a woman a social pariah. In fact, many remarried, especially if they were wealthy, skilled, or the kind of person who could wrestle a goat without flinching. Of course, not all separations were peaceful. Some involved accusations, feuds, and the occasional dramatic saga, or the exit. But even then, the culture generally accepted that sometimes people just move on. The gods were chaotic. Why not relationships? It's also worth noting that men could divorce too using Thesa method, though their reasons usually involved lack of obedience, which probably tells you everything you need to know about male expectations. If you think modern weddings can get weird, wait until you hear what the Vikings were doing with their goat sacrifices, bridal swords, and extremely awkward bedroom rituals. Viking weddings weren't just a party. They were a political merger, a legal contract, and a community event with strong opinions and an even stronger smell of smoked fish. The festivities could last up to a week, depending on how wealthy or dramatic the families were. Think of it as Game of Thrones with fewer dragons and more passive-aggressive toasts. The bride and groom each had symbolic preparations. The bride had her hair unbraided, a sign of maidenhood ending, and sometimes wore a breezing arm-in-style necklace if her family was feeling extra mythological. The groom, meanwhile, might retrieve his ancestral sword because nothing says, "I'm ready for commitment," like brandishing a weapon at your in-law. But here's where things get very Viking. The consummation. It wasn't just encouraged, it was mandatory. And in some regions, it had to be witnessed. Yes, witnessed. In some cases, a few unfortunate authorities stood by the door, torches in hand too. Make sure the couple sealed the deal, and didn't just pass out from me and nerves. Why? Because this wasn't about love. It was about validating a contract. Marriage affected inheritance, land rights, alliances. So if you didn't follow through, someone might challenge the legitimacy of the union later. That's how you end up with lawsuits and blood feuds. Much simpler to just awkwardly nod from outside the curtain and hope for minimal eye contact. Of course, not every wedding was that dramatic. In less theatrical comedies, the act was simply assumed, or at worst, verified, through loud bragging the next morning over breakfast stew. There were also rituals involving hammers, "Hello Thor," shared drinking horns, and solemn oaths sworn before witnesses, and gallons of it. In fact, the honeymoon originally referred to drinking honey made for a full moon cycle after the wedding, to boost fertility, romantic, and slightly sticky. By now, you've probably realized that Viking intimacy wasn't all pillaging and grunting. It was layered, strategic, wildly poetic, slightly magical, and occasionally performed next to a goat. Viking culture didn't treat sex as something shameful or hidden. It was a part of life, like farming, raiding, or wondering if your neighbor was plotting revenge. It served purposes, both sacred and practical, producing heirs, forging alliances, settling scores, and sometimes just getting through a very long winter. Passion existed, absolutely, but it came tangled in reputation, law, honor, and community expectations. You didn't just fall in love. You made sure your great aunt, your livestock, and 3 sword-carrying uncles approved. Romance wasn't private. It was a group project. The sagas themselves, those sweeping epic tales, are full of love, jealousy, clever women, and emotionally unavailable men. Some stories end in dramatic weddings. Others end with one partner sailing off into the fog, while the other stabs a cousin for looking smug. Either way, it's drama, beautiful, windswept, emotionally messy drama. And through it all, Viking women, passive background characters. They seduced, divorced, cursed, negotiated, and occasionally set things on fire. They were respected for their wit, feared for their curses, and occasionally remembered in verse, which in Viking terms is the ultimate compliment. Even there, gods treated love like a battlefield. Loki transformed genders. Frey paraded his fertility like he a prize-winning squash, and Odin dabbled in romantic magic without blinking. The divine set the tone. Love was powerful, unpredictable, and definitely not PG. So, what was sex really like for the Vikings? It was communal. It was poetic. It was legally complicated. It could win Mjolnir, or get you exiled. It was public in all the wrong moments, and weirdly progressive in all the right ones. And perhaps most Viking of all, it wasn't about being perfect. It was about surviving love with your pride, your farm, and your sword arm intact. Because one, the Norse, did love, they did it, like everything else, with fire, flair, and absolutely no apologies. If you were a medieval peasant, don't imagine holidays meant sipping wine by the fire while someone else did your chores. No, holidays were holy days. Religious observances sprinkle legendaries across the calendar. On paper, it might have looked like you got a break from back-breaking work. In practice, you might still be roped into helping fix the church roof, cook stew for the entire village, or chase thepigs that escaped during the festivities. Still, it beat digging turnips. Dekirch, bless it, gave the peasantry dozens of feast days. We're talking Christmas, Easter, Saints' Days, Marian festivals, and random local holiday shinoring relics, like St. Gertrude's toenail. These weren't optional. They were sacred timeouts, where you were expected to pause labor, attend mass, and ideally reflect on your sin-soaked soul. But peasants, ever pragmatic, found ways to turn these holy days into moments of joy, feasting, and barely controlled drunkenness. Ule, for instance, wasn't just a single day but 12-12. That's 12 days of storytelling by the hearth ale sloshed caroling, and if you were lucky, someone might show up with a roasted pig. It was the meaty of a Netflix binge and holiday potluck rolled into one. But don't get too comfortable. While your lord might not expect rent payments during a feast day, he might expect your son to serve wine at his table, or your daughter to help dress the lady of the manor in her saint day rest. Holidays could blur the line between sacred restand, unpaid community service. Still, there was something deeply communal about them. These weren't individual spa days. They were everyone in your village dressed in their best, red-leased moody tunic, shared the limited food supply, and pretended for one day that life wasn't all toil, taxes, and toothachs. So yes, peasants had holidays, a surprising number of them, in fact. But each one came with strings attached. Attend church, don't work the fields, maybe help with the mystery play, and for heaven's sake, don't get caught skipping mass to nap in the Hoft, unless you want a stern talking to from Father Bartholomew, and a week's worth of penance. ROA, the most magical time of the year. Assuming your idea of magus includes dead animals on spits, evergreens nailed to beams, and your uncle passed out in a haystack. For medieval peasants, Ule wasn't just one day of celebration. It was 12 long, glorious, occasionally chaotic days between Christmas and Epiphany, where the rules of daily life loosened, and even the poorest souls got a taste of festivity. It all began on Christmas Eve, when the Ule log, an actual tree, not a chocolate cake, was dragged into the hearth and kept burning throughout the season. Its ashes were considered lucky, which made sense, because keeping a giant log ablaze for 12 days in a medieval house was essentially a controlled house fire. Feasting was central to Ule, although what counted as feasting varied dually. If your village had a generous lord, you might be blessed with extra meat, ale, and a communal pig roasting on a spit. If not, then dried beans, mystery stew, and bread, with actual salt, counted as a luxury. You took what you could get, and then you sang about it loudly, off-key, and often while drunk. There were songs and games, too, and masks, because nothing says birth of Christ like dressing up as a bear and terrorizing your neighbors. These traditions carried whispers of older pre-Christian customs. remnants of pagan solstice rituals repackaged with Christian branding. Evergreens, for instance, symbolized eternal life, and hanging them indoors wasn't just for decoration. It was to ward off evil, or in peasant logic, the rats. It was also a rare time when social norms flipped. Some villages appointed a lord of misrule, usually the biggest idiot available, who was given temporary authority to mock the gentry and orchestrate games. For 12 days, the lowest could act like the highest, until the calendar flipped, and reality came crashing back down like a thatched roof in January. Still, for all its noise and nonsense, Ule was sacred, not just in the religious sense, but in the It was warmth in the cold, light in the dark, laughter in a world where teeth were optional by age 30. In those 12 days, peasants weren't just survivors, they were celebrants. And come January 6th, back to work, Thepic's bones were gone, the ale was sour, and your wife was glaring at you to patch the barn roof you ignored for a week. If Ule was about ale and ashes, May Day was all about flowers and fertility, and not just the kind in the fields. For medieval peasants, the 1st of May wasn't merely a date on the calendar. It was a riot of color, music, and mischief, celebrated with the kind of reckless joy only possible when winter was finally over, and the crops hadn't failed yet. The festivities began at dawn, when villagers trotted into the woods to gather May branches, blossoms, and sometimes a bit of scandal. Young people, especially, embraced this tradition, often vanishing in pairs and returning a little more rumpled than they left. Elders may have raised their eyebrows, but no one complained. After all, a few extra babies born in early February were just part of the rhythm of village life. At the heart of celebration stood the maypole, a tall wooden pole, planted in the village green and bed-keyed with ribbons, flowers, and enough local symbolism to make a Freudian blush. Peasants danced around it in weaves and circles, laughing, sweating, and pretending it wasn't basically a fertility totem left over from earlier, more openly pagan times. The church disapproved, of course, but not enough to stop the dancing. Even Father Bartholomew occasionally tapped his foot. Music filled the air, drums, flutes, bagpipes, if you were unlucky. There were plays, races, wrestling matches, and in some villages, leaping over bonfires to prove your courage, or in a year's luck. And while much of this was deeply symbolic, celebrating the rebirth of nature, the hope of the harvest, it was also a rare and glorious excuse to just have fun. Peasants who spent most of the year in ragged tunics pulled out their best, often still ragged clothing, adorned themselves with garlands, and crowned a May Queen. She represented springtime, youth, and beauty, which in peasant terms usually has most of her teeth and no visible boils. Unlike religious holidays, May Day wasn't bound by church bells or scripture. It was older than saints, older than sermons, a festival of the body, as much as the spirit. And though the local lord might still extract a labor tax the next morning for that one flower-dented day, even the lowest born could dance like they ruled the meadow. In medieval Europe, the calendar was bursting with saints, and each one came with a feast day. You'd think that meant endless parties. And technically, yes, Beautimogen, celebrating your great-aunt Mildred's birthday every other day. And she's also a martyred nun who died of gangrene. Welcome to the divine chaos of saints' days. Peasants loved saints' feast days, not necessarily for theological reasons, but because it was a legitimate excuse to stop plowing and start eating. These days often included a village mass followed by hours, or days of merrymaking. Think processions with relics, mystery plays in the mud, barrels of ale, crack it open before noon, and that one barefoot guy shouting about Sam Blaye's miraculous fishbone removal. Each village had its favorite patron saint. Some chose practical ones: Saint Isidore, for farmers; Saint Apollonia for toothaches. Others went with local legends, like Saint Ethelbert of Nowhereru, allegedly cured leprosy, and hiccups. Whoever the saint, the feast day involved honoring their memory through rituals, prayers, and possibly roasting a goat. If your town was lucky enough to possess a saint's relic, a finger bone, a piece of cloth, or an item dubious labeled St. Agnes' actual eyeball, the feast day became a full-blown festival. Pilgrims might visit. Merchants set up stalls. Mrs. put on theatrical renditions of the saint's life, often mixing spiritual inspiration with accidental comedy, collapsing props, and at least one guy forgetting his lines. The best part, you didn't work, at least not in the field. You might still beasked to help with decorations, play trumpet badly in the parade, or fetch water for the communal stew, but it wasn't back-breaking toil, and you probably got a crust of meat and some holy gossip in return. Of course, the kept a watchful eye on these celebrations. Too much wine, too much dancing, and suddenly what began as Appius event risked devolving into a full-blown peasant rave. Still, most clergy understood that joy, even messy, muddy, slightly blasphemous joy, was better than despair. And if singing songs about St. Bridge while sloshing ale kept morale high, so be it. Before Lent, that 40-day joy vacuum of fasting, praying, and pretending you didn't just eat cheese behind the church, came Carnival, and for medieval peasants, it was the one time of year where chaos wasn't just allowed, it was blessed. Carnival, also known as Shrovetide, was the season of sanctioned misrule. Think of it as the medieval version of spring break, but with more turnips and fewer regrets. It kicked off right before Ash Wednesday and acted as a spiritual pressure valve. If you were about to spend weeks living like a monk, you had to party like a heretic first. Masks came out, often great score, animal-like, allowing peasants to become something else entirely. Devils, kings, talking pigs, people cross-dressed, made rude songs about the nobility, and staged mock parades where the village idiot was crowned king of fools. For once, the line between lord and laborer was hilariously, dangerously blurred. Thiefhood, absolute madness. You had to eat all the fat, meat, and dairy wouldn't be allowed during Lent. That meant pancakes, sausages, butter, soaked everything, assuming you could get your hands on such luxuries. It was a last hurrah for the taste buds beef, for Lent arrived, and reminded everyone they were dirt and ash. There were games too. Peasants hurled flour bags at each other, staged mock battles in fields, and occasionally attempted to ride farm animals like noble steeds. One particularly popular event was the peasant joust, where two drunk villagers at each other with cabbages tied to sticks. The winner earned nothing but bruises and bragging rights. And Willity Church frowned upon the wilder elements, the lewdness, the mischief, the chicken stealing. They also knew better than to cancel it. Carnival wasn't just fun, it was catharsis. It was a time when peasants scowled invert the world, laugh at the powerful, and feel even briefly like masters of their fate. Then came the ashes. As Lent arrived, the masks were burned, the songs stopped, and the world went quiet. Meat vanished from the table, bells tolled solemnly, and the same villagers who danced half-naked around a bonfire 2 days earlier knelt in church, solemn and hungry. But the memory of Carnival lingered. Araminder, that joy, like wine, should be savored while it lasts. What do you get when you mix religion, theater, and a troupe of semi-literate farmers with a flair for the dramatic? Mystery plays, the blockbuster entertainment of the medieval world, long before Netflix, TikTok, or even Shakespeare. Peasants gathered to watch sweaty neighbors reenact the Bible in full costume, sometimes on wagons. Mystery plays weren't mystery in the modern sense. They weren't crime thrillers or whodunit. The term came from ministerium, Latin for craft, or guild, since local guilds were often in charge of producing them. So the Bakers' Guild might perform the Last Supper while the butchers took on the crucifixion. Naturally, Nothing says divine, suffering like actual pig's blood. Performed during major feast days and religious festivals, these plays turned public squares into makeshift theaters. The villagers would flock in muddy boots and all to watch scenes from Genesis, Exodus, or Revelations, acted out by their own neighbors in robes held together with haywine and goodwill. Some plays traveled through town on wagons, each one staging a different scene, like a divine parade of biblical drama. The performances weren't always, shall we say, theologically accurate. Noah's wife might be portrayed as a nagging shrew who refuses to get on the ark until she finishes her beer. Devils in red tights chased sinners through the crowd to howls of laughter. And when Herod delivered a fiery monologue, Etaphan ended with someone chucking vegetables at his head. The line between piety and peasant comedy was flexible, but these plays weren't just entertainment, they were education. Most peasants couldn't read, and Latin sermons might as well have been bird noises. Mystery plays made the stories of Scripture tangible, emotional, visual, memorable. A man in a crown of thorns, screaming in agony, that stuck with you far more than a dusty scroll ever could. Plus, the plays brought people together. They required costumes, props, rehearsals, and coordination. Entire villages worked side by side, topple them off, even if the angel forgot his lines, or St. Peter's beard caught fire from the stage torch. It was a holy mess, but it was theirs. In medieval peasant life, a wedding wasn't just a personal affair. It was the villagist's excuse to throw the biggest legal party it could get away with. Technically, it was a sacrament. Spiritually, it was a public contract. Practically, it was a festival where the ale flowed freely, and half the guests left with Samianil's cloak. For peasants, marriage was as much about social duty as romance. Families arranged unions for land, labor, or livestock. The bride's dowry might include a pig, a sack of barley, or a decent-looking goat. Love was optional. Breeding strong Sancho could lift a plow. Mandatory. The festivities began with a ceremony, simple, brief, and usually outdoors. Right at the church door, witnesses were essential. So were blessings. But don't expect choirs and organ music. You might get a single-stringed fiddle, if you were lucky, or old Joffrey trying to whistle through his missing teeth. After the vows, it was time for the re-celebration, the wedding feast. Everyone was invited. Neighbors, family, the thatcher, who never finishes on time. Because hospitality was sacred, guests brought whatever they could. Bread, eggs, maybe a roasted bird, if they were feeling generous. The bride's family provided the bulk, which sometimes meant boiling a single chicken in a tub of turnips and calling it stew. Then came the dancing hours of it, possibly days. Medieval peasant dances weren't delicate minuets, they were a stomping, spinning, mudslinging affairs where everyone got dizzy and someone usually fell in the fire. The local musicians played whatever instruments hadn't been stepped on. There were games, too. Jokes, booty laws, boardy songs, and contests that ranged from who can drink the fastest togas, how many children they'll have before the first harvest. All done with the cheer of people who hadn't had this much fun since last May Day. At some point, the newlyweds would be escorted to bed, literally by the entire village. This bedding ceremony involved blessings, laughter, and just enough uncomfortable chanting to make it weird. Then the curtains closed, and 9 months later, you guessed it, another festival. Despite the many feast days, festivals, and official holidays on the medieval calendar, peasants quickly learned a hard truth. A holy day didn't always mean a lazy day. More often than not, it means different work, just with slightly more singing and marginally better food. Sure, the fields might rest and the oxen got a break, but that roof still leaked. The priest's barn still needed sweeping, and someone had to cook the communal stew that was mysteriously made entirely of onions and hope. Holidays weren't about idleness. They were about public service with extra candles. Let's say it's St. Swethin's Day. No fieldwork. Great. But you're now helping erect a flower arch out of dead branches. Then you're drafted into the mystery play as Roman soldier Napatu, whose only job is to yell blasphemer and fall in the mood on cue later. You're stirring a cauldron in the churchyard while Father Bartholomew micromanages your seasoning. Even the 12 days of Ule weren't pure. Someone had to gather firewood, brew the ale, roast the questionably boar, and keep the Ule log burning, which basically required a night shift rotation if it went out early. Bad omen, possibly the Black Death. No pressure. Children and elders didn't get off easy either. The kids were tasked with gathering herbs or delivering awkwardly shaped bread to neighbors. The elderly were expected to sit near the hearth and tell stories, preferably ones that didn't end in fire, plague, or goatscaping. Though, to be fair, those were the best ones. Some villages had traditions like church cleaning day, which was cleverly scheduled on a saint's feast to make it sound less like a chore. And if your local lord decided he wanted a new banner sewn or a moat cleared before his feast, guess who got volunteered? Of course, there were still bright spots. Work on a feast day usually came with extra food, maybe a gulp of ale, and the camaraderie of neighbors grumbling in unison. Plus, nothing built community quite like hauling a rotten log out of the village pond together. For medieval peasants, life was brutal, but not entirely joyless. In fact, the calendar was peppered with enough festivals, holy days, saints' feasts, and village weddings to give even modern planners a headache. These events didn't just provide moments of rest. They offered structure, meaning, and a rhythm to a life otherwise ruled by mud, toil, and taxes. Each season brought its own blend of sacred and social celebration. Winter held the warmth of Ule, candlelit masses, and storytelling by the fire. Spring delivered May Day, full off blossoms, bonfires, and blushing faces disappearing behind hedges. Summer was the time for saints' processions, pilgrimage fairs, and maybe, just maybe, a feast hosted by the manor lord that didn't taste like turnip surprise. Autumn closed the loop with harvest festivals. These weren't as flashy as Carnival or Ule, but they were deeply satisfying. After months of sweating in the fields, peasants gathered for communal meals, thanking the saints for not sending famine or locusts again. There was dancing ale and roasted things that probably shouldn't have been roasted, but no one complained. Even the fasting seasons like Lent and Advent were part of the rhythm. They made the feasting sweeter, the celebrations more profound, and while the church might have hoped peasants would spend those days in quiet repentance, most simply switched to grumbling and thin broth until the next excuse to party rolled around. The joy wasn't just in the celebration itself, but in the anticipation, planning a mystery play, brewing ale, sewing ribbons into old tunics. These were acts of hope. They gave peasants something to look forward to, a chance to feel alive, connected, and part of something larger than themselves. And that perhaps was the real miracle of the medieval festival calendar. It stitched together a world constantly on the edge of illness, invasion, or starvation, with moments of laughter, music, and collective relief. Whether dancing around a maple, falling off a pageant wagon, or burning their fingers on a Ule log, peasants found a way to celebrate the absurd and divine alike. In the end, they didn't need luxury, just time, community, and a reason to lift a mug and shout, "Blessed Saint, whoever, we made it through another year." Saladin, or, as his contemporaries knew him, Yusuf bin Abu, was born in 1137 in the town of Trit, in what is now Iraq. It was an unremarkable start in a turbulent land. His Kurdish family wasn't royalty, but they weren't peasants either. His father Ab was a military officer in service to the powerful Zen dynasty, who ruled over much of Syria and northern Iraq. Still, no one looked at young Yusuf and thought, there goes the future liberator of Jerusalem. Unlike most warlords of his time, Saladin wasn't raised in a blood-soaked training yard. He grew up in Baalbek Anthon, Damascus, where his education included theology, mathematics, law, and poetry. He studied the Quran deeply and developed a lifelong love of learning. He wasn't some brash teenage sword swinger. He was quiet, reflective, and almost bookish. His early mentors described him as gentle and deeply devout. Not exactly the stuff of war epics, not yet, but the world around him was anything but peaceful. The Crusaders still held Jerusalem, and the Muslim world was fractured by petty rivalries. Different emirs ruled different territories, each more concerned with power than unity. Sunni and Shia factions jostled for control, and alliances shifted faster than a desert wind. Into this mess, Saladin stepped not as a self-declared hero, but as a loyal servant under the command of his uncle Sharu, a tough-as-nails general in the service of Nur ad-Din, the ruler of Aleppo. At this point, no one expected greatness from Saladin. He was smart, yes, obedient, devout, but he wasn't particularly charismatic or war-hardened. He wasn't groomed for power. In fact, when he was first sent on campaign to Egypt alongside Sharu, some records suggest he went reluctantly. His interests were spiritual, not strategic. Politics bored him. And yet, destiny had their plans. And once Egypt opened its gates, so too did opportunity. What made Saladin unique wasn't that he craved power, but that he wielded it with humility when it came. He entered the story as a background character, a nephew, an assistant, a quiet man in a loud world. And somehow, that quiet man would go on to change history. Saladin didn't march into Egypt expecting a crown. In fact, he didn't want the all. In the 1160s, Egypt was ruled by the crumbling Fatimid Caliphate, a Shia regime beset by civil unrest, famine, and endless court intrigue. When the Crusaders and various Muslim factions started poking around, Nur ad-Din sent his trusted general, Saladin's uncle Shuru, to restore some order. Saladin, ever the beautiful nephew, followed. He was supposed to assist his uncle, not lead a country. And yet that's exactly what happened. After a few years off-Macy campaigns, backroom deals, and some very suspicious natural deaths, Sharu seized control of Cairo and promptly died. Just like that, the sword had barely cooled in its sheath before the question emerged. Who takes over now? Enter Saladin. Reluctantly, Thekrid expected an easily controlled figurehead. They saw a quiet, religious man with little charisma, and even less political ambition. Perfect. But within months, Saladin showed he was anything but a placeholder. He moved fast. First, he consolidated power in Cairo, outmaneuvering rivals with a mix of diplomacy, piety, and sheer competence. Then, in a bold move, he quietly dismantled the Fatimid Caliphate from within. He re-established allegiance to the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, ending 2 centuries of Fatimid rule. It was a religious and political earthquake, and Saladin did it without mass bloodshed or palace massacres. But don't mistake mercy for weakness. He cracked down on corrupt officials, improved infrastructure, and reformed Egypt's chaotic finances. He surrounded himself with scholars and judges. He even made food more affordable for the poor. To a battered and divided people, he brought stability, and to outsiders, he sent a clear message. Egypt now had a real leader. Still, Saladin didn't style himself as a king. He was Nur ad-Din's loyal servant for now. But tensions began to build. The student was rising. The teacher grew wary. Egypt was no longer just a distant post in a crumbling empire. It was the beating heart of Saladin's rising power, and while he hadn't sought the throne, now that he sat upon it, he ruled with purpose. The reluctant savior had become a sultan in everything but name, and soon the rest of the Muslim world would take notice. Saladin's next challenge wasn't the Crusaders, it was his own side. After stabilizing Egypt, Saladin faced a fractured Islamic world. The Seljuk Empire was splintered. Syria was under the rule of his former patron Nur-Adin, who was now deeply suspicious of Saladin's growing influence. And elsewhere, ambitious emirs bickered over scraps of territory, while Jerusalem remained in Crusader hands. Theoretically, they all served the Samagad. In practice, they couldn't organize a potluck, let alone a holy war. Then in 1174, Nur-Adin died suddenly, and once again a power vacuum opened, and Saladin stepped in. At first, he framed his actions as loyal service. He claimed to be preserving Nur-Adin's legacy, even marrying into his family. But let's be honest, Saladin was done being a subordinate. He moved north, took Damascus with barely a fight, and began the slow, patient process of stitching the Islamic world back together, not by conquest alone, but through marriages, alliances, bribes, and when necessary, the occasional siege. Cities that had ignored each other for decades suddenly found themselves answering to the man from Trit. Aleppo resisted. Of course so did Mosul. But one by one, the pieces fell into place. And unlike many rulers of his time, Saladin wasn't known for backstabbing or cruelty. He pardoned rivals. He kept oaths. He made it hard to hate him, even for those he defeated. This was a quiet revolution. He wasn't trying to build an empire for ego or gold. He believed unity was sacred, that Muslims could not defeat the Crusaders while squabbling amongst themselves. And he knew the window was closing. The Crusaders were strong. Jerusalem was fortified. If there was ever a time for the Muslim world to stand as one, it was now. By the late 1170s, Saladin controlled Egypt, Syria, parts of Iraq, and even the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. He was no longer a regional governor. He was the Sultan of a pan-Islamic realm built not on brute force, but strategy, patience, and astonishing restraint. But his greatest test was yet to come, and it flew a cross-shaped banner. Because while Saladin had conquered cities and united kingdoms, he had not yet fulfilled Thedrum burning in every believer's heart, the liberation of Jerusalem. By the 1180s, Saladin's attention turned fully toward the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. The holy city had been in Crusader hands for nearly 90 years, a painful wound in the heart of the Muslim world, but retaking it required marathon ambition. Saladin needed timing, preparation, and most of all, a reason that would unite fragmented allies behind a single cause. That reason came courtesy of the Crusaders themselves. One of the most volatile figures in the Crusader estates was Rield of Charshan, a man so famously unhinged he made other Crusader lords look like cautious monks. Rield repeatedly violated truces with Muslim caravans, attacked pilgrims on their way to Mecca, and even threatened to march on the holy cities of Islam. For Saladin, this wasn't just an insult. It was divine provocation. When Rield attacked a caravan in 1187, during a time of peace, no less, Saladin had his justification. No more retroces, no more diplomacy. War was coming. The Crusaders, sensing the threat, assembled their full might. King Guy of Lusignan led the army alongside Rield and the Knights Templar. It was a formidable force, thousands of men, heavily armored, confident in their superiority. But they made a fatal mistake. They marched across the arid plains of Galilee in July, toward the springs of Tiberias, thinking they'd surprise Saladin. Saladin let them come. He knew the terrain, he knew the heat, and he controlled the water. His troops harassed the Crusaders, constantly cutting off their access to wells and springs. By the time the Crusader army reached the twin hills, known as Thayerns of Hattin, they were exhausted, dehydrated, and trapped. On July 4, 1187, Saladin struck. The Battle of Hattin wasn't just a victory. It was a masterpiece of strategy. The Crusader army was annihilated. Thousands were killed or captured. The true cross, the most sacred relic in their possession, was seized. King Guy was taken prisoner, and Saladin personally executed Rield of Charshan. not out of vengeance, but for breaking sacred truces. With one battle, Saladin shattered the military backbone of the Crusader states. There was now nothing standing between him and Jerusalem. But what would he do when he reached the holy city? Conquerors usually took with fire and blood. Saladin had some things in mind. In the aftermath of the crushing victory at Hattin, Saladin swept through the Levant like a desert storm. Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, Ascalon, all fell with minimal resistance. The Crusaders were broken, leaderless, and on October 2nd, 1187, just 3 months after Hattin, Saladin stood before the gates of Jerusalem. The city was defended by Barelian of Ibelin, one of the few Crusader nobles still standing. Though outnumbered and desperate, Balian negotiated with Saladin, not for victory, but for mercy. He warned that if the city were taken by force, the defenders would destroy the shrines, slaughter Muslim prisoners, and burn everything they could. It was a desperate bluff. Saladin didn't call it. He chose peace. It was here that Saladin's true legacy was carved, not in stone, but in restraint. Unlike the bloody sack of Jerusalem during the First Crusade in 1099, when Christian soldiers massacred tens of thousands, Saladin's entry was disciplined and deliberate. There was no general slaughter, no desecration of churches, no rivers of blood. He gave Christians the option to ransom themselves, their families, and their neighbors. Many were freed without payment, especially the poor. Saladin even paid the ransom for hundreds who couldn't afford it. He allowed Christian priests to remain and continue services. The Church of the Holy Sephilah was untouched. Holy sites were protected, not out of political savvy alone, but genuine religious principle. For Saladin, this wasn't weakness, it was justice. He believed that Jerusalem, sacred to Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike, should not be soaked in vengeance. To wield power without cruelty, that was the true expression of faith. His mercy shocked Europe. To lease off his honor spread even in enemy lands. Chroniclers who hated Islam still wrote of Saladin with reluctant admiration. Some even compared him favorably to their own kings. In reclaiming Jerusalem, Saladin had done what few thought possible. He not only reversed decades of Crusader conquest, but did it with dignity and restraint. The city washes, but the world, watching from afar, began to realize that his strength lay not just in his sword, but in the way he chose not to use it. The Christian world wouldn't take this humiliation lying down, and from the west, a familiar shadow began to stir. News of Jerusalem's fall hit Europe like a thunderclap. Popes preached vengeance. Monarchs sharpened their swords, and at the head of this new crusading storm stood Richard, the Lionheart, King of England warrior, and one of the few men on earth whose name could rival Saladin's. Thus began the Third Crusade, not just a military campaign, but a high-stakes duel between two icons. Saladin, the seasoned sultan with a reputation for mercy. Richard, the brash, brilliant tactician with a taste for blood and glory. The world watched as these two legends collided. Across the hills and plains of the Levant, Richard arrived in the Holy Land in 1191 and immediately captured Acre. It was a brutal siege, and when negotiations with Saladin stalled, Richard executed 2,700 Muslim prisoners in a single day. Saladin, who had gone to great lengths to spare Christian lives in Jerusalem, was furious. But he didn't retaliate in kind. Instead, he tightened his discipline and focused on strategy. The two men never met in person, but their duel was deeply personal. They clashed at Arsu, where Richard won a tactical victory, but failed to destroy Saladin's army. Every battle was amateur-class in warfare. Richard was aggressive and clever, launching ambushes and flanking maneuvers. Saladin was patient, harassing enemy supply lines, conserving strength, avoiding wasteful bloodshed. But this wasn't just a military contest. It was a contest of ideals. Richard was undeniably brave, but often ruthless. Saladin, though a formidable commander, continued to show mercy and honor, even sending physicians to treat Richard when fell ill. Despite his victories, Richard could never reach Jerusalem. Logistics, weather, and Saladin's defenses held him back. Eventually, Bothman knew they were at a stalemate. Neither could land the final blow. So, in 1192, they made peace. The treaty, Jaffa allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem, but left the city under Saladin's control. It was a compromise, not a triumph, but a balance. And both men, exhausted and war-weary, honored it. In the end, Saladin had defended the holy city, without razing the land. Richard returned to Europe, a hero, but Jerusalem remained Muslim. 2 lions had roared, but only one still held the crown. Saladin's battlefield prowess made him famous, but it was his character that turned him into legend. Unlike many rulers of his era, Christian or Muslim, Saladin didn't bathe in cruelty or surround himself with sycophants. He was devout, modest, and astonishingly humble. For a man who ruled an empire from Egypt to the borders of Mesopotamia, he slept on mats, gave away personal wealth to the poor, and wept openly at sermons. No palaces dripping with gold, no extravagant displays. Just a man who believed power was a test, not a prize. He fasted regularly, even outside of Ramadan, and studied the Quran with the same intensity he applied to warfare. Saladin prayed before battles, but more importantly, he prayed after them, not in thanks for victory, but in mourning for the lives lost. When his advisors urged him to punish enemies harshly, Hayaftin refused. Victory is not in killing, he once said, but in forgiving, and it wasn't just words. After Jerusalem, he could have razed churches, executed prisoners, and paraded through the city in triumph. Instead, he protected holy sites, released captives, and ensured safe passage for Christian pilgrims, including those who couldn't pay. He even gave charity to Jewish communities and maintained cordial relations with Eastern Christian sects. Saladin's generosity extended beyond religion. He donated his fortune to the poor Morathon once. He paid the dowries of orphaned girls. He built schools, hospitals, and water fountains. His court was filled not with gold-plated armor, but with scholars, jurists, and poets. But for all his gentleness, he wasn't naive. Saladin understood diplomacy, timing, and power better than most. Kings knew when to show strength and when to pull back. He wielded fear like a scalpel, rarely, but precisely. And when executed Reinald of Chatton, it wasn't vengeance. It was justice, delivered liney, and without spectacle. Saladin didn't just lead an army, he led by example. His piety wasn't for show, his mercy wasn't weakness, and his restraint wasn't cowardice. He became something rare in medieval history, a man admired equally by his allies, enemies, and centuries later. But even legends must fade, and Saladin's final chapter was not written with a sword, but with silence. In 1193, just a few months after signing peace with Richard the Lionheart, Saladin fell ill. He was only 55 years old, hardly ancient by medieval standards, but years of constant warfare, political negotiation, and spiritual devotion had taken their toll. The man who had once ridden across deserts and scaled fortress walls now lay in bed, weakened by fever. He didn't summon his generals. He didn't hoard riches. Instead, he turned inward, spending his last days in prayer, reciting verses from the Quran, and giving away what little remained of his personal wealth. And that's not poetic exaggeration. When Saladin died, his treasury was so empty that there wasn't enough money to pay for his own funeral. The man who had ruled empires left behind 1 dinar, 47 dirhams, and a legacy worth more than any crown. His death was not dramatic, no assassination, no poisoned chalice, just a quiet exit befitting the humility with which he had ruled. He was buried in Damascus near the Grand Mosque, not in some golden tomb or fortified palace, but in a modest mausoleum. His coffin was draped in simple cloth, and no royal regalia marked his resting place. Years later, Emperor Wilhelm II of Germany would visit his tomb and donate a new casket, one made of marble. Even Europe's royalty, long after the Crusades had ended, paid their respects. Saladin's empire did not last long after his death. Like many great leaders, his strength had held together a fragile coalition, and once he was gone, his sons and nephews squabbled over the pieces. Syria, Egypt, and Mesopotamia soon drifted apart again. But Saladin himself was never forgotten. In the Islamic world, he remained the embodiment of righteous rule, a warrior who fought for justice, not conquest. In the Christian world, he became their enemy, remembered with respect, even reverence. European chroniclers called him noble, wise, and even holy. Descriptions not typically reserved for infidels. It was said that he kept a shroud near his bed as a reminder that nothing, not kingdoms, not fame, not even Jerusalem, would follow him to the grave. And yet, centuries later, his name still does. Saladin died in 1193, but his legend never did. In fact, his reputation only grew not just in the Muslim world, but across continents, cultures, and unlike many medieval rulers who were forgotten or vilified, Saladin was remembered as something almost mythical. A man of war and peace, faith and tolerance, power and humility. In the Islamic world, Saladin became a symbol of what righteous leadership should look like. For centuries, sultans, merchants, even poets of the imperial court sought out Yoshuara, not just for pleasure, but for the chance to duel in verse with women whose pens were as sharp and kafs invoked his name to legitimize their own rule. Though few could match his grace or discipline. His model of jihad was not driven by fanaticism, but by duty. He fought to defend lands and people, not to glorify himself. He ruled with fairness, governed with scholars, and died with empty pockets. In many ways, he became the gold standard, the ideal Muslim ruler that others pretended to be. But perhaps more surprisingly, Saladin was embraced by the Christian world as well. Despite being the chief opponent of the Crusades, European historians and poets painted him in glowing terms. Dante placed him in the virtuous pagans of the Divine Comedy, a high honor in a Christian cosmology. Baccio wrote of his generosity, and in the centuries that followed, Saladin became a Catholic hero in European romances. By the 19th century, Western leaders invoked his name as a model of noble conduct, even during colonial wars in the Middle East. His name became larger than his empire. In modern times, Saladin's name has remained potent. Arab nationalists of the 20th century invoke Adim as a symbol of unity and resistance. Statues of him still stand in Damascus and Cairo. Streets, schools, and even battle tanks bear his name. He is seen not just as a military hero, but as a bridge. A figure who commanded respect from both his own people and perhaps that is Saladin's greatest legacy. Not just that he retook Jerusalem, or defeated crusader kings or ruled an empire, but that he proved it was possible, even in an age of blood and steel, to lead with compassion, to fight with honor, and to leave behind a legacy not of terror but of respect. He died a sultan. He was remembered as something far greater. The Yoshiara district in Ideto wasn't merely a place. It was an entire world sealed behind wooden gates and floating on the edge of fantasy. Official is sanctioned by the Tokugawa shogunate in 1617. It was created to keep pleasure contained, controlled, and out of sight. What emerged, however, was something far more complex. A dazzling dreamscape of painted faces, fluttering silks, and tragic love stories whispered behind paper walls. At its heart were the courtesans, not simply prostitutes, but cultural superstars. The highest ranking among them, the Own, were icons of refinement. They trained 4 years in the arts, poetry, music, calligraphy, and the subtle language of flirtation. They wore layer upon layer of embroidered kimono, their hair adorned with ornate pins like miniature weaponry, their movements rehearsed to perfection. A single glance from an own could cost a fortune, a conversation, even more. From the outside it looked like luxury, but inside Yoshiwara was a gilded cage. Once a woman entered the pleasure quarters, often as a child sold by desperate parents. Her fate was sealed. Contracts could last decades. Debts were nearly impossible to escape. She was renamed, redressed, and remedento, someone marketable. The outside world became a rumor. The irony: these women were masters of performance, adored for their elegance and charm, and yet they were prisoners, not by chains, but by silk and obligation. And for the customers, Yoshiwara offered illusion. Whoosed. As much as flesh. Samurai could shed their armor, merchants could pretend they were poets, and everyone could forget their caste for a night. But the illusion only lasted as long as the night did. Come morning, names were forgotten, and love, if it had sparked at all, was left to rot in memory. True affection was dangerous in Yoshiwara, forbidden even. A courtesan falling in love risked punishment, or worse, being sold off to another house. A samurai caught loving beneath his class faced ruin, and yet it happened again and again. Whispers of forbidden romance curled through the alleyways like smoke, always lingering, never safe. This was the paradox of Yoshiwara, a world built to sell love, where real love could only destroy you. In the world beyond Yoshiwara's gates, outsiders often confused geisha with courtesans, but inside the district, the lines were sharply drawn, even if the sometimes blurred under candlelight and perfume. Courtesans, especially the high, were the stars of Yoshiwara. They were legally classified as sex workers, but culturally revered like celebrities. Their clients didn't just pay for a night of pleasure, they paid for the performance of desire, a living poem stitched in silk, art, untouchable unless pursued with the patience of a monk and the fortune of a day. Courting one could take months, and that was by design. Only the wealthiest and most persistent could ever hope to sharia futon with her. Geisha, on the other hand, were entertainers, not lovers. They played the shamus and composed witty haiku, and poured sake, with grace honed over years of apprenticeship. Their art was their allure. To confuse a geisha for a courtesan was an insult, both to her profession and to the strict social codes that governed Yoshi. A geisha might flirt, tease, or dance cinches from a client's face, but if he expected more, he'd be laughed out of the tea house. But beneath those careful distinctions, both roles shared a painful truth. Choice was a carefully curated illusion. Most women in Yoshiwara did not arrive by ambition. They were sold, orphaned, or simply too poor to survive outside the walls. Even those who rose to fame were bound by debt, contract, and reputation. Leaving the profession, especially at its peak, was almost impossible without a patron wealthy enough to buy her. This practice, Muki, was rare and not always romantic. It could mean rescue, or simply a new form of ownership. And yet, many women found ways to carve out moments of autonomy. A witty remark in the tea house, a rebellious glance during a dance, a secret poem left in a client's sleeve. Within the rigid structure of Yoshiwara, subtle defiance became its own art form. The world saw painted smiles and flawless choreography. What it missed were the sacrifices, Maddie behind the curtain, and the delicate negotiations of survival performed night after night under flickering lanterns. In Yoshiwara, power was always rented, never owned. In theory, the samurai had no business falling in love in Yoshiwara. They were men of honor, duty, and strict codes, beholden to their lords, loyal to the shogunate, and expected to embody stoic restraint. But Yoshiwara was a world designed to make men forget who they were, and for a certain kind of samurai, it was more than a distraction. It was a trap, one lined in silk, incense, and smiles that knew too much. Romances between courtesans and samurai were strictly taboo, not because they were rare, but because they were far too common and far too dangerous. For the courtesan, love threatened her carefully cultivated image. A courtesan couldn't afford favorites. She was a commodity, a living dream. If she loved, she risked ruining both her livelihood and the fragile balance of power within the brothel. For the samurai, the stakes were even higher. Falling for a courtesan meant compromising honor, risking scandal, and worse, disobeying the rigid class divisions of Tokugawa society. Samurai weren't meant to love women off the pleasure quarters. They were meant to visit, enjoy, and forget. Love was not part of the transaction, and yet, it happened. Sometimes the samurai would come again, spending beyond his means, writing haiku in secret, smuggling love letters, tucked in fans. Sometimes the courtesan would respond, a subtle squeeze of the hand, a hidden verse slipped into his sleeve. These weren't affairs. They were quiet rebellions against a world that demanded masks at all times. The consequences, however, could be brutal. There are stories of samurai who sold their swords to afford time with their beloved. Some lost their rank, their wealth, even their lives. A few were caught and ordered to commit seppuku, ritual suicide, to atone for their disgrace. As for the women, punishments ranged from public humiliation to forced transfers to harsher brothel. But most devastating were the stories that ended not in scandal, but in sorrow. Lovers who realized there was no escape, no future, only the fleeting scent of incense and a promise made too late. That's when the most tragic outcome would unfold. The double suicide pact, Shinju. Two lovers bound by a love the world refused, choosing death over another day apart. In Yoshiwara, some romances bloomed like cherry blossoms, beautiful, brief, and destined to fall. In a district where every glance was choreographed and every touch had apparenced. The only place love could breathe was in the space between words, and in Yoshiwara, words, not whispers, were how forbidden hearts spoke. Poetry wasn't just a pastime in the pleasure quarters, it was a secret language. Haiku tanker and short prose poems fluttered through the air like falling blossoms, traded between geisha courtesans and clients, with the weight of emotion too dangerous to speak aloud. A carefully composed verse hidden in a fan or tucked into a kimono sleeve could carry the longing of an entire heart without ever mentioning love by name. For thee and other courtesans, poetry was part of their education. They were trained to compose on the spot, to weave elegance into sorrow, flirtation into metaphor. A courtesan might respond to a client's longing poem with a delicate rejection, a verse about an unreachable moon, or a river too wide to cross, but she did return his feelings. Her words could become a lifeline, a promise, or a secret vow. Samurai, as their eyes, love letters weren't crude. They were art folded with precision, spritzed with plum blossom perfume, and slipped discreetly into sleeves, or sandals. But each poem was also a risk. A love letter discovered by a madam could mean punishment. A client seen lingering too long north, same house could be marked. And if a samurai's lord caught wind of his affections, it could destroy his career or worse. Still, the verses persisted. Some became legendary, preserved in old notebooks, reprinted in literary collections, even copied by later lovers, hoping to capture the same desperate beauty. Others were burned before dawn, their ashes carried off like secrets too dangerous to keep. In a world where love was a transaction, poetry allowed it to be something else, something fragile, fleeting, and forbidden, something you could hold in your hand, read under candlelight, and for a moment believe was real. For most women in Yoshiwara, freedom wasn't a dream. It was a calculation, a number, a price. Courtesans, especially the elite, were bound by contracts as heavy as any chain. They owed debts for their training, their costumes, their housing, even the daily food they consumed. Every kimono, every hair stylist, every performance, all of it was logged, charged, and stacked onto a running tab that grew faster than it shrank. The only way out was muck, the act of buying bought out. A patron, usually a wealthy merchant or retired samurai, could pay full amount owed and secure the courtesan's release. It sounds romantic, and sometimes it was, but more often it was a trade. One gilded cage, exchange for another. Some women were truly rescued, married into wealth, or allowed to start quiet lives, far from the red lantern glow of a detto. Others simply moved from one role of servitude to another, concubine, mistress, or unofficial second wife, kept behind closed doors and paraded only when convenient. Even in freedom, they were rarely treated as equals. Then there were those who tried to escape without payment. These stories really ended. Well, Yoshiwara was guarded. Surveillance was tight. Women caught trying to flee were punished severely, paraded through the streets. Their hair cut off in shame or transferred to lower-ranking brothel, where conditions were even harsher. But sometimes, rarely, a courtesan managed to vanish, disguised as a servant, hidden in a palanquin, escorted by a lover willing to risk everything. These women became urban legends, whispered about in Tia houses, immortalized in kabuki plays, always, with the same bittersweet ending. Freedom, but at what cost? And yet, despite the risk, the idea of escape never vanished. It lived in thestories they told each other, in the folk songs sung softly at night, in the poems hidden under tatami mats, because in Yoshiwara, even the most obedient courtesan carried two lives, the one she performed, and the one she dreamed of when the lanterns dimmed. A life outside the brothel walls, and Namathat was hers again. A love that didn't come with a receipt. Escape was rare, redemption was rarer, but in a world built on illusion, hope was the one thing no one could tax. In a place designed to sell pleasure, some oft most enduring love stories from Yoshi are tragedies, and none looms larger than the haunting ritual of Shinju, the lover's suicide pact. These weren't melodramatic gestures or theatrical legends, though kabuki plays often turned them into both. They were aerial, chilling events born from desperation. In Yoshiwara, when a courtesan and her lover faced a world that forbade their union, when freedom was impossible, when debt was crushing, and when love became unbearable, death felt like the only escape. Most pacts followed a pattern. The courtesan, often locked into a long-term contract, could not leave the brothel without a massive buyout. Her lover, typically a samurai or wealthy merchant, might have family obligations, societal expectations, or a declining fortune that made escape impractical. They would meet in secret, write poems, share final cups of tea, then disappear into the night, to the riverbank, the forest, or a rented room. Some cut their throats with hidden blades. Others drowned themselves in nearby canals, tied together with silken cords. Their bodies were often found, still entwined, as if even death couldn't pry them apart. The public reacted with a mix of horror, and officials condemned Shinju as immoral and disruptive. Brothel tightened security. The shogunate issued laws banning the performance of such stories on stage. And yet the people could not look away. These tragic deaths were romanticized in literature and song transformed into folk legends and kabuki spectacles. Plays like The Love Suicides at Amogema turned real-life despair into cultural mythology. Audiences wept. Poets composed LAs, but behind the drama was the raw truth. These were people so trapped by societal roles, so starved for dignity, that death seemed kinder than life. Not every courtesan died in love. Most survived, endured, and aged out of Yoshiwara quietly. But the ones who chose to die, or had no real choice, carved themselves into Japan's cultural memory, with blood and blossoms. In a world obsessed with performance, Shinju was perhaps the only act that couldn't be faked. In the candlelit days of Yoshiwara, art was more than decoration. It was defiance. Every fan flutter, every stroke of calligraphy, every carefully arranged kimono fold was a form of silent resistance against a life that was anything but free. The courtesans and geisha of the pleasure quarters were artists by design. They were trained in traditional music, dance, ink, painting, poetry, and etiquette. Their job was to embody the ideal of feminine beauty, intellect, and poise, an impossible standard made real through relentless discipline. But these weren't passive performance. They were acts of control in a world that stripped these women of almost everything else: beauty armor, a flawlessly styled wig, a poem that captured heartbreak in 17 syllables, a dance that communicated longing without words. These weren't just performances for clients. They were ways to maintain identity, dignity, and a sense of self in a world built to erase them. When a courtesan bowed with perfect grace or composed a haiku under pressure, she was saying, "I still exist. I still choose how I am seen." The art also traveled outside the brothel walls. Woodblock prints, ukiyo, or pictures of the floating world immortalized the courtesans in vivid color. Artists like Kitagawa, Utamaro, and Suzuki Harunobu captured their lives in a woman adjusting her hairpin, a geisha looking out a window, lovers meeting under falling cherry blossoms. These images became wildly popular, collected by commoners and nobles alike. They turned courtesans into icons, while also revealing the loneliness behind the beauty. Some courtesans even became images. Their likenesses appeared in paintings, plays, and erotic novels. Their poems were published in small chatbooks, traded like treasure among literati. For a few, this artistic fame offered something rare: a voice. Still, the art could never fully reflect the truth. Behind every print was a woman with debts. Behind every poem, a contract. Behind every graceful smile, someone counting the days until she was free or too old to be desired. But art gave them something. They weren't supposed to have agency. It allowed them to shape their narrative, even if only in fragments. And in a world designed to control their story, even a fragment was power. In Yoshiara, beauty wasn't just currency. It was a ticking clock. Every paint face, every silken sleeve, masked an expiration date. And while the world outside the pleasure district may have worshipped the courtesans as icons of grace and sensuality, inside everyone knew youth was the business, and it didn't last. The courtesan's value began to decline the moment she reached her peak. Her schedule lightened, her customers aged. New girls arrived, fresher, more fashionable, more in demand. And so, like a fading lantern at dawn, her time in the spotlight grew dimmer until it quietly vanished. There was no grand farewell for most women. No ceremony, no parade. Some retired quietly, having paid off their debt, and opened small tea houses or became hairdressers. Others took on behind-scenes roles, training new girls, styling hair, or managing guest bookings. But many simply disappeared, cast out of the pleasure district when they no longer sold illusions. Some were lucky enough to be bought out before time caught up. A wealthy patron might whisk them away to a private estate or offer marriage, though. Even that rescue often meant a different kind of servitude. For those who aged out without a sponsor, survival meant adaptation. And adaptation, in a society that valued a woman's beauty above all else, was often humiliating. In rare cases, former courtesans reinvented themselves as okami, respected proprietors of tea houses or inns where they used their wit, contacts, and social skills to stay afloat. But these were exceptions. Most left Yoshiara with little more than a change of clothes and the memories of a life both dreamlike and exhausting. No one painted woodblock prints of them once their cheeks lost their blush. Napotes wrote odes to sagging eyes or aging hands. The very world that once worshipped them erased them the moment they stopped glowing. And yet in those quiet exits there was something honest. The illusion had lifted. The silk robes were folded away. The smile was no longer required. Because in Yoshiara, the tragedy wasn't just in the love luster. Youth faded. It was in the silence that followed. When the music stopped, the candles burned out, and the woman behind the mask finally walked home, unnamed and unseen. Today, the lanterns of Yoshiwara no longer glow. The narrow streets that once echoed with laughter, music, and whispered poetry are now paved over with apartment blocks and convenience stores. But the stories, they linger like smoke. Yoshiwara officially closed in 1958, when legalized prostitution was abolished in Japan. By then, the district had already Fertility, a relic of its former self. Bombings during World War II had ravaged much of its architecture. The Orno-Tepa leisure houses, the fan shops, the perfumed tea rooms, all gone. And with them, the lives of thousands of women, erased from public memory. But Yoshirun ever really died. Its spirit survives in kabuki plays, yuki prints, novels, and old poems, still taught in classrooms. The ARN processions are still reenacted in festivals where young women wear towering wigs and 12-layered kimonos to honor those who came before. And while few remember their names, the courtesans of Yoshiara remain etched into Japan's cultural imagination, not just as entertainers, but as survivors, poets, and silent revolutionaries. Modern Japan struggles with their On one hand, these women are romanticized, transformed into symbols of elegance and mystery. On the other, their suffering is often overlooked. Their lives are still misunderstood, blurred by fantasy and shame. They weren't just women in elaborate makeup, they were children sold into bondage. Artists who turned performance into power, lovers who risked everything for a moment of real connection. And maybe that's why their ghosts still walk. Many locals tell tales of Oshiwara's spirits, women, seen wandering the alleys late at night, their kimono trailing behind them, searching for something lost. Others say the old brothel sites carry a strange stillness, as if the pace refuses to be paved over completely. Whether or not you believe in ghosts, the truth is this: Yoshiara is part of Japan's soul. It is the memory of a hidden world built on illusion, stained by tragedy, but also filled with unmatched beauty and fleeting joy.